then we have a look at some of the suggested topics. So how do we link Ajax request with Python request handlers? So the way we are going to look at that is we're going to look at PyCharm. Last lecture I did a little bit with Flask already, but now we need to see how does this actually work with your assignment. So first of all, you were given this users file. So this is the page. It's not very pretty, so the first thing I will go and do, because this is just what I downloaded from what you had, is I'm going to reformat the code for the file. Normally I would use the shortcuts. I use this a lot. And yes, PyCharm, at least the professional version, has support for JavaScript and for HTML. So we can see the page. So yes, I was running Flask at the moment, but let's skip that. So this is the page, and this represents our users. I can show that to you directly, but let's first actually take this file and make it available. So what we need to do this is we first need to put it in our static folder. We just copy it. So I hold down the control thing. We copy it there. Let's call this index, or we can call it users.html. It doesn't really matter. So we can add it to our version control here. And then we need to tell our application to find it. So what we want to do is we add, so what Flask does, it's basically a way, it has this application object, and given this application object, so yes, you want to probably import all these things to make stuff work, and there's more elements that you can add from Flask. There's extensive documentation on Flask that you might want to have a look at. In any case, so we create a Flask object given the name of this file, and that Flask object can then be used to call these decorators. So these decorators, basically, they do some changes on your function, but in our case, it's not really important how they work. What they do is they tell Flask in its web server that when you run your that basically when it receives a request that matches the particular route, it needs to call this particular function. So if it sees a request that starts with the relative, all these are relative URLs, because the host name is something that you get from your operating system, and the port, the same thing. We don't want the web application never works with absolute URLs. It always works with relative URLs, more or less. So, or almost always. So in this case, if we see the request for the resource test.html, we're going to send this static file test.html. How does it find this? Well, the send static file function, so we press Ctrl Q, we get the documentation, and here is the short documentation. We can possibly click on this and that should open a web page. Okay, yes, it opens the web page with the API. We're not going to go into the specific, but that's how it works. Let's go back to PyCharm. Because so Flask has a lot of functions in the app module that can do a lot of these things. In this case, which is a static file. In many cases, you just want a lot of, say, okay, everything in CSS is a static file. So what you can do is you can have this placeholder in your, so this is a convention that Flask uses. If it sees these angle brackets, it will treat those angle brackets as the name of a parameter that needs to receive whatever is there. So in this case, so we basically, this file here matches this file attribute in the, or the file parameter in the function. So when you ask it for a CSS something, slash CSS dot something slash something, it will return that file. So let me have a quick, before we do this, so let's run the Flask actually, because one of the things I can do is just use a terminal command called curl, and then we go and look in our run, and what is our URL? Okay, it's localhost 5000. It uses the IP address, but I know it's a thing, so localhost is slightly easier to type, 5000. And then we can do something like, okay, test.html, and it will return this particular content, which happens to be the content of this file, test.html. We can also do something like, okay, give us css slash test.css. In this case, it will return this content, which is this particular file. You can see that there's no line end at the end of line 3. There was, so it would basically put this stuff around. Now, if I do this again, it will actually have a new line at the end of the thing. Same with the test.html, so you probably want to do this. That vn bit is just part of the console here that we're using. So if we want to say, okay, if but that CSS, that test.css works because not because it is correct, because yeah, so it says just send the static file.css. We could also create a file so how does this work? We could actually say, okay, we want to get test.html here. That is actually, there's no requirement that what you ask for CSS is actually a CSS file, so this works as you can see. We don't necessarily want to do that, and you can possibly have things like, okay, if you make this into .css, that it wouldn't do that. I probably need to reload Flask for that to make that work. If I now do the same thing, it says it doesn't exist, but we can still do test.css. No, it doesn't work with test.css. Again, so there are some limitations. So those are the difficulties with working it. So I'm not a Flask expert, so there probably is a way of doing this correctly, or you could do your own check. In this case, one of the common ones is what happens if you just click on this particular URL. You get a default page. So the route for that is just slash. So by currently, what happens if you invoke slash is just, it will just return this just hello application programming principles. It doesn't even return a new line. So this is not an HTML page, and if I by the way, there are also headers being sent alone, so you can actually output that to the standard, to the output, and now we can see the content being outputted, returned. So it says it's content type HTML because Flask by default says it's HTML output. It actually isn't, but we don't know. So it has this Werkzeug server using this Python version, etc. This per server information. Content length is 45 bytes, and it uses HTTP1 to respond. Probably because a curl asked for HTTP1. I'm not. So, or because the server says I find it easier to support HTTP1 than a harder version. So how do we then actually make our users HTML work? Well, that's fairly simple now, isn't it? What we want to do is basically want to take this code, send static file, and say, okay, we want to return the static file users.html. When we do this as well, what we want to do is, so we want to make CSS files work. We also might want to make JavaScript files work. So one of the things I'm going to do here is create a CSS directory. I'm creating a new JavaScript directory. It's not mandatory, but it's good standards to sort this stuff up. So we put the CSS file there, move it there. Yes, PyCharm is really powerful, so it can do all this stuff, try and do it nicely. In our case, what we need to do is we basically say, okay, so CSS plus file. So we do make this work. Let's first rerun Flask. And we make another request to the CSS file. And yes, it does work. Great. So now we can actually copy this function. So we just select this and you type Ctrl D and it creates a duplicate. And we just change that into JS. We should give it a different name and a different location. So the name of the function in our case doesn't really matter, but give it something that's useful. So in this case, we want to say, okay, we call this main application, something like that. So this would send users.html. So let's reload it and go back to our terminal and say, okay, now we can actually open the users file. And yes, it works. And I have prepared already the ability to actually display this properly. So this is the way it actually looks on your system. So look. So what you see here is that you have your users, and you can so it will return 6 users, etc. So this is the unstyled version that you have been working on. It's just static content. It doesn't do anything. It gets well, except for the images that it automatically downloads from Regress, because that's how it's configured.